Security Forum, here to talk about defense, national security, and Israel's current position. Thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
I want to start with the news of 2 days ago, which was the resignation of Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi and Southern Command head Yaron Finkelman. What are your thoughts in terms of their resignation, and who is in line to assume the position?
Well, I think obviously both of them are directly responsible, together with the head of Shin Bet, for the terrible tragedy of the 7th of October, and it was obvious that at a certain point they should resign. The army desperately needs new spirit, new leadership, and it's definitely a good time to do a change of command. There are 3 officers that are being interviewed for the position of Chief of Staff of the Army. One of them is Tamir Yadai. Tamir Yadai commanded the Golani Brigade in the Second Lebanese War. He was division commander on the Egyptian border, Division 80, and they commanded the ground forces. A very, I would say, fierce warrior with a lot of experience on the ground, and knows very well warfare and how armies fight in big wars. We have Amir Baram, who is the former deputy of the chief of staff, a paratrooper. He commanded the Northern Command, commanded the paratroopers, but he was in position on the 7th of October, which I think makes it a somewhat more problematic position for him as the deputy of the chief of staff, as part of the decision making on that level. In this sense, also Tamir Yadai was the commander of the ground forces on the 7th of October, and he is also part of the army that failed that day, but he didn't have, I would say, an operational responsibility or intelligence. He was building up the ground forces, so it's a bit different position. And then we have the CEO of the Ministry of Defense, Eyal Zamir, was the deputy of the Chief of Staff. He commanded the Southern Command. When he was commander of the Southern Command, he had a full plan to conquer Gaza fully. And when he finished his position, this plan was thrown away and nobody dealt with it anymore.
What year was that?
To remember, it was like 5 years ago, something like that. He was very clear that Gaza, needs to be conquered, that we need to be prepared for that. He trained the Southern Command for that. He prepared the command. But then he was replaced, and they stopped dealing with this plan. And when he finished his position as the deputy of the chief of staff, when he spoke in the event at the end of his career, he talked about the preconception. He talked about the terrible decisions that were made to shrink the army, the ground forces, the munitions that were not bought. He was very aware of that, and he had a completely different mindset than the chief of staff and some of the other generals. So in this sense, he's definitely very, very relevant to this position.
And when we talk about having a new spirit and being able to bring new ideas and command, obviously to get to a certain position, to be eligible to be the Ramat Kal, to be the head of the IDF, you need to have had experience in the system. So how do you balance having previous experience with actually being able to innovate new ideas and be an independent thinker and have different ideas and avoid what led to October 7th?
Yeah, so I think that all the 3 candidates have a vast experience and are definitely ready to take such a position. And now the question is, who is really the guy that can make the big changes in the army? We want the army to be much more war-driven, dealing with readiness, fighting, not dealing with politics. We want an army that promotes officers that think out of the box and are strong, and not people who just agree with their commanders and therefore they are promoted, as we saw in the past. We need a true cultural change in the army. And the big question is, which of these commanders is able to really, really bring a new vision? It's my gut, since I cannot prove it, but I feel that Eyal Zamir is very relevant, and also Tamir Yadai. These are two officers that tend to think out of the box and have the leadership to really lead the army.
So this is not something that's typically discussed in terms of frontline national security and thinking in terms of conquering Gaza and Lebanon. My first time I came across Tamir Yadai's name was in the context of equipment, and I think he was given bad information from people under him when it came to the readiness and whether or not people had equipment. I ended up on the exact opposite side of the issue, and obviously he came out and banned donations, even though people were openly defying him because they knew that they needed donations to have equipment, whether it's Lebanon and Gaza. So when we talk about cultural issues, how do we really fix that? Because I don't think Tamir Yadai was going around checking every single base and saying, what do you have here? What do you have there? I think that people were giving him bad information. So even if you put someone who has a better way of thinking at the top, how do you ensure that the culture gets changed, especially now that it's really go time? We're not sitting here and obviously there's ceasefires, temporary or not, but we don't have time to sit here and have big idea classes where there are hostages in Gaza. There are active combat zones. So how do you actually change things from the bottom to the top?
I think that the art of command in the army, of leadership, is on one hand, listening to your staff and to the top commanders that work with you. And on the other hand, an hour later, taking your car, driving, visiting, the units, the platoon commanders, the company commanders, being on the ground, visiting the forces, talking to them, and not only visiting, but really talking to them, asking the questions, really make them feel that they can say anything and they can really share what they feel and what they need, whether it's operational issues, intelligence, equipment, whatever it is. I can tell you, for example, when I was the head of the officers course of the combat engineers, and we used to have a very big drill of all the different corps of the courses of the officers. And when I was young, all the generals used to come for a whole day, look at the drills and talk with the young cadets and really understand what's going on. 20 years later, not a single general came to this huge event. They all got stuck, in Tel Aviv, in the Kiryat, wasting their time with PowerPoints and presentations. And already when I was commanding the School of Combat Engineers, I said, this is terrible. This phenomena where people, instead of really being connected to what's going on in the field, start to waste their time all the time in the headquarters and whole days looking at PowerPoints, which don't
I
really
think that's
reflect
someone who,
reality.
right. So
A
someone
problem.
who's just a lay leader and someone who's trying to help soldiers, I could hear what you're saying. The first time that was really clear to me was when there was a Magad who I spent extensive amount of time with on the phone, going over things they were missing, and we're making sure that they got proper equipment. We're going out trying to make sure everything was set. And the very next day, Herzi Halevi came to visit the base, and they had this whole conversation, and he's in photos with him. It was strange to me that if you really know that you're missing certain things operationally and you're doing it, that you didn't necessarily have a freedom or the ability to have that connection. To me, it signaled something as an outsider. I don't really know.
Yeah.
I can't
So
speak for
the
the army.
big question is, what is the mindset when a general comes to visit? Do you want to show him that everything okay, even if it's not the case, or you really want to say things that they are, what is okay and what is not, and what you think, and if you think maybe that things need to be done differently. The big problem is when you start seeing commanders feeling that they need to appease, they need to be nice, they need to show that everything is okay, and then the commanders don't get the real sense of what's going on. But it's their responsibility to really create an atmosphere that encourages the young commanders to speak up and, say exactly what they think without being afraid that they will be judged, that they won't be promoted or something like that. And
Right.
so I think that one of the biggest changes that the new chief of staff will have to do, it's not about equipment and it's not about budget, it's about culture. It's really changing the basic culture of the army.
And I'll say this, one of the, just we talked about Tamir Yadai and the equipment. After he issued the edict about not accepting donations, Bislach went and they were still getting donations. And one of those donations, the drone actually located Yihya Sinwar when they chased him into the building. And again, so it's about being able to bridge things without being fearful. Like you said, I think it's really important. So I want to ask you about, from an insider perspective, there's this idea that things really changed between when Yoav Gallant was the Minister of Defense and when Yisrael Katz became the Minister of Defense. From inside the Army, what's the difference when you have a Minister of Defense who seems to be on the same page as the Chief of Staff versus when you have a Minister of Defense who seems to be more challenging of a Chief of Staff?
I think that ministers of defense who come from the army, who have been generals in the army, on one hand, they have a lot of experience, they understand the issues professionally, but on the other hand, they tend to see everything eye to eye with the army. They don't really challenge the army. And I think it's a responsibility of the Ministry of Defense to look at it from a different perspective, challenge the thinking, bring new ideas. He's also responsible for much broader issues than the army itself. And I think that now this change between Gallant and Katz, is not taking everything the army says as if it's Moses bringing, the Ten Commandments from the Sinai mountain. He's thinking about it, he's challenging them. And I think it's good. It's a healthy relationship.
And how does it work between the political echelon and the army in terms of actual battlefield execution? Because I know certainly in the aftermath of October 7th, there's this idea that the political echelon is telling the army what to do and that the army doesn't really have power to make decisions in that way. And then on the other side, the political echelon is saying, we come up with the ideas and the army's kind of tactically doing it. So therefore, we're not really so involved. And they're two camps that are trying to volley. From your inside perspective, how does the political echelon work with the chief of staff, and how does that affect the battlefield?
The cabinet, led by the prime minister, they define what are the goals that need to be achieved, looking from their perspective, from the statecraft. And the army needs to say how it's going to achieve it. It needs to present options, plans, and say what it means, how much time, what's the level of danger, and so on. And then the cabinet approves the plan, and the army goes and executes. Many times, the army is proactive. They come and have ideas. They say, okay, we think this is what we should do. And they present plans, and these plans, in many cases, are approved. So this is the process, basically, that going on. And it's a dialect. I mean, you don't want it to be just, the politicians saying, you need to do this, and the army just saying, this is how we'll do it. You want the army to be proactive, to bring ideas, to challenge, to bring their perspective. Obviously, the army sees things from a military perspective, but also they try to understand the international environment and so on. Politicians have completely different considerations, and some of them are political, and it's okay, they're politicians, not supposed to take political considerations. And then you have to bridge between these two very, very different worlds. And at the end of the day, approve plans and go and execute them.
Has the political echelon worked well with the military echelon in the Gaza frontier, in your opinion?
I think there were a lot of achievements, but I think that the relationships were very tense, that the politicians lost faith with the army, the terrible failure of the 7th of October, and it took time to regain really trust. We've seen occasions where the prime minister is more, I would say, resolute and wants to see things out of the box, and the army more careful. And sometimes it's the opposite. For example, when the head of Mossad said, let's go and do the operation with the pagers, the army didn't support that. And we know how successful.
Why would the army disagree? What was their take on it?
Well, I think that while the Northern Command was very, very confident and they wanted to defeat Hezbollah and do the job, and also the political level were very confident, on the general staff level, they were less confident, more worried about how a war with Hezbollah will look, and they were more careful dealing with this. But at the end of the day, once the cabinet said, we are attacking Nasrallah, we are using the pagers and so on, as days went by, everybody felt more confident and ended up with a very big win against Hezbollah.
So many topics to cover in only a few more minutes. I want to get your opinion on a potential national commission of inquiry. I know there's some families that are pushing for that national commission of inquiry when it comes to October 7th, and saying that this will restore trust and security. There are other families who say that they don't trust such an inquiry because they don't want it to be from a political level because they have issues with the courts and they're not sure. What's your take on how such a review should commence?
So obviously we need an inquiry and we need to figure out what happened on the 7th of October and also much before. I mean, to really understand the 7th of October, you need to go 20, 30 years back. Oslo, disengagement, the way they build the army, the culture, the way of thinking. It didn't start on the 7th of October. This is an outcome of a very, very long process with many, many problems. If you really want to understand what needs to be done in the future, you need to look very broadly at everything that happened before in the defense establishment and also in the governments, the different governments throughout the years that also failed miserably, I would say, to build a secure Israel. Now, the question is what kind of inquiry is going to be, whether it's going to be appointed by the Supreme Court, which in Hebrew we call ועדת חקירה ממלכתית, or it's going to be a political inquiry agreed between the coalition and the opposition. Now, the coalition is saying there is a lot of mistrust with the judges. We saw everything that was going on in the judicial reform. We don't trust this kind of inquiry. Many citizens don't, and they say, look, let's agree on a group that will be 100% agreed between the coalition and the opposition. Each one will appoint half of this committee that will do the inquiry. And then we can say that everybody is represented and there are representatives from the coalition and the opposition, and the public will accept it from both sides.
If you had a vote on the matter, which do you think is the best way to go about it?
So I think that both options are possible, but the big question is who are the people at the end of the day, and what's the scope of the inquiry. And it's not just about looking at it personally and saying that the chief of staff failed or the prime minister or anybody else. It's really about learning the lessons, really building an understanding that will enable us to really think the right way how to secure Israel for generations to come.
And when we talk about securing Israel, obviously the IDF just commenced activities in Yehuda v'Shamron and with the ceasefire in Gaza. How do you anticipate things playing out in Yehuda v'Shamron for the next 3 to 6 months?
So Israel is using the ceasefire to achieve two things. One, to get the hostages, at least big part of them who are alive, and move the units to Judah and Samaria and launch an attack on the terror infrastructure in Jenin, in the Samaria area, possibly other areas. I think it's going to go on for a long time, and Israel wants to dismantle all this terror infrastructure. So the army is not stopping for a moment. We have a ceasefire in Gaza. We are fighting now in Judah and Samaria. Once the ceasefire will be over in Gaza, units will go back probably to Gaza and fight and forward the goal of eradicating Hamas as a governmental and military entity.
So you say once the ceasefire is over, when do you think the ceasefire will end? From my sources and people on the ground, there seems to be a working assumption that the first phase is really the only phase. And obviously there are people that are pushing for a second and third phase, but it seems to be that the first phase is really what the army is preparing for. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think that at the end of the first phase, it's going to be very, very challenging to convince Hamas to release the remaining hostages without military pressure, without completely dealing differently with the humanitarian aid and disconnecting Hamas from the humanitarian aid. Without pressure, I don't see why Hamas would be motivated to give us the hostages.
So I asked this yesterday to audience. I said the last 10 years when Aron Shul, thank God his body's been returned, and Hadar Golden were held, their bodies were held. Hamas was given billions of dollars, both from countries and from international aid organizations. So we've proven that they still get aid. And right now, they've proven that they don't care about their buildings, they don't care about their people. They're fine with people being quote unquote martyred for the cause. So why would they give back all of the hostages? They might just keep people and put out videos every couple of months to torture Israeli society.
Yeah, and this is why you need massive, massive military humanitarian pressure on Hamas to bring the reality where they want to bring back the hostages. And I don't see how it can happen without that. So yes, I would assume that after the first stage, if we manage to do hold the stage, I'm not even sure that this will happen. But obviously, if Hamas will say we want 2 more months of ceasefire and we'll release the remaining hostages, of course Israel will agree to do that to get the hostages. As long as it's crystal clear, we're not giving up the goal of eradicating Hamas. Once the ceasefire is over and we go back to fight, or Hamas capitulates.
And you think that
lays down the weapons and leaves Gaza.
And you think that there's both political and military will to completely eradicate Hamas? Because one of the stated war goals was total victory, eradication of Hamas.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think that there will be a government if they don't do that. I don't think that on the political level and even the society, people can accept a reality where Hamas is not eradicated and we don't win in Gaza decisively. I don't think it's an option. And I think that also looking at the coming chief of staff, the first thing the chief of staff will want to prove himself is that he will win the war. This is what the next chief of staff will have to do and finish the job, win decisively on all fronts. I see this will in the army, and I see it also within the government.
Last question before I let you go. When we're talking about cultural shifts, and kind of Ofer Winter and a few others have been very publicly maligned and seem to be pushed aside. And there seems to be some right-wing pressure to incorporate those ideas and to bring more pluralism to the top-line thinking. Do you anticipate that any of these thinkers that have been sidelined before might have a chance of being involved in decision-making going forward?
Might be that the next chief of staff will bring back to the army some of the brigadier generals or generals that have been released lately, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see what will be the policy of the next chief of staff. We definitely need strong generals that are resolute, that want to win, and are all about victory.
General Avivi, I really appreciate your time. For those of you who are interested in more, I'll post in the show notes how to find General Avivi, his briefings, and information about the Israel Defense and Security Forum. Really appreciate your time. And
thank you very much.
God willing, we'll have good days ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much.